Welcome. This is my channel and I tell stories of the mysterious, twisted, and paranormal. So please stick around and consider subscribing and turning on your post notifications. Now, I got a story for you today that will entertain you. So relax and enjoy, and remember, as of now, it's time to slip into a mind that's not our own. So let's go. Guys, just to let you know, this story is for mature audiences only, and there will be some points where I am not going to say the exact words. I'm going to use words like romantic or excited because this story is explicitly graphic, especially in a sexual nature. But I did everything that I could to make it more friendly to the average person's ear. So with that being said, I hope you enjoy. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was born October 16th, 1936 in Yabloshoy, a village in the heart of rural Ukraine. And this is the time when Russia was the USSR, and it was also known as the Soviet Union. So during the 1930s, Ukraine was actually known as the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, and the policies of communism through Stalin's enforcement caused widespread hardship within the country, leading eventually to a famine that decimated the population. So Andrei was also known as the Rostov Ripper. So for the story, we're going to give him a name and we're going to call him Romanov instead of saying his real name. And after Romanov's birth, the effects of the famine were still widely felt, and his early childhood was influenced by this deprivation. And it was made even worse when the USSR entered the war against Germany, causing Ukraine to be the subject of relentless bombing raids. In addition to these external hardships, Romanov is believed to have suffered from hydrocephalus, or water on the brain, at birth, which gave him urinary tract problems later in life, including bedwetting, into his late adolescence, and he also had problems as well, such as erectile dysfunction, which could have caused him to resent this illness in many ways later in life. So his home life was disrupted by his father getting held captive by Germany in the war, and then vilified by his own countrymen for allowing himself to be captured when he finally returned home. And just like in other countries such as Japan, honor was something that the USSR lived and died by. And in the Soviet Union at that time, young Romanov suffered the consequences of his father's cowardice, making him the focus of unfortunate school bullying. He was very shy as a result of this, and at the age of 15, he had a somewhat romantic encounter that was anything but romantic. He was reported to have overpowered a young girl and then doing the deed, you could say, with her in a very quick fashion, which caused him even more ridicule. This humiliation colored all future romantic experiences and cemented his association of sex with violence. Then later on, he failed his entrance exam to Moscow State University, then moved to Rodionovo Nastoyevsky, a town near Rostov, in 1960, where he became a telephone engineer. His younger sister moved in with him, and concerned by his lack of success with the opposite sex, she engineered a meeting with a local girl, Faina, whom he went on to marry in 1963. Now, I think soon enough you're about to find out where the name the Rostov Ripper comes from. Even with his romantic problem, should I say, him and his wife were still able to produce 2 children and lived in outwardly normal family life, to say the least. Then in 1971, a career change to school teacher was short-lived when a string of complaints about indecent assaults on young children forced him to move from school to school to school before he finally settled at a mining school in Shakhty near Rostov. On December 22nd, 1978, the Rostov Ripper killed his first documented victim, who was 9-year-old Lena Zaktanova. She was lured into an abandoned shed where Romanov tried to rape her. So trying to control the struggling child, Romanov slashed her with a knife. And when he did that, at that moment, he also, well, let's just say he got excited, which confirmed his psychological connection between violent death and sexual gratification that went on to correlate with all future attacks. And an eyewitness had seen Romanov with the victim shortly before her disappearance, but his wife provided him with a cast iron alibi that enabled him to escape the attention of the police. Now, believe it or not, there was a 25-year-old Alexander Kravchenko with a previous rape conviction who was arrested and confessed to the crime under duress, probably as a result of extensive and brutal interrogation. He was tried for the killing of Lena Zaktanova and executed in 1984. Perhaps as a result of Romanov's close brush with the law, there were no more documented victims for at least the next 3 years. It is believed that within those 3 years that there were no documented victims. It was because the brush of possible incarceration scared Romanov, but it seems even being in close proximity of the eyes of the police couldn't stop him from killing in the end. So Romanov, still being upset by the claims of child abuse, he found it impossible to find another teaching position. And when he was made redundant from his mining school post in early 1981, he took a job as a clerk for a raw materials factory in Rostov, where the travel involved with the position gave him unlimited access to a wide range of young victims over the next 9 years. On September 3rd, 1981, Larissa Tkachenko, who was 17, became his next victim. She was strangled, stabbed, and gagged with leaves to prevent her from crying out. And the brutal attack was savagery, and he began to develop a pattern of attack that saw him focusing on young runaways of both sexes, whom he befriended at train stations and bus stops before luring them into nearby forested areas. Now, at that point, Romanov would attack them, and he would attempt to rape them using his knife as a substitute for, let's just say, his little friend. And he did this to mutilate them. And I know this must be very disturbing to hear. I almost felt sick reading the story, and I'm sorry if this brought you any discomfort at all. Then, in a number of cases, he actually ate the sexual organs or removed other body parts, such as the tips of their noses or tongues. And in the earliest cases, the common pattern was to inflict damage to the eye area, slashing across the sockets and removing the eyeballs in many cases, an act which Romanov later attributed to a belief that his victims kept an imprint of his face in their eyes even after their death. Now, at this time in history, serial killers were a virtually unknown phenomenon in the Soviet Union, whether as a result of suppression of information or wider cultural differences between Soviet and Western societies. Evidence of serial killing or child abuse was often suppressed by state-controlled media in the interest of public order. And the eye mutilation was a method distinct enough to allow for other cases to be linked. This is when the Soviet authorities finally admitted that they had a serial killer to contend with. Now, as the body count mounted, rumors of foreign-inspired plots and werewolf attacks became more prevalent, and public fear and interest grew, despite the lack of any media coverage. And in 1983, Moscow detective Major Mikhail Fetisov was seconded to Rostov to assume control of the investigation. Now, he recognized that a serial killer might be on the loose and assigned a specialist forensic analyst, Viktor Burakov, to head the investigation in the Shakhty area. The investigation centered on known sex offenders and the mentally ill. But because of current interrogation methods of the local police, and that they regularly solicited false confessions from prisoners, it felt Burakov was skeptical of the majority of these confessions. Progress was slow, and not all the victims' bodies have been discovered, so the true body count was unknown to the police. But with each body, the forensic evidence mounted, and police were convinced that the killer had the blood type AB. Also, samples of identical gray hair were also retrieved when a further 15 victims were added during the course of 1984. Now, police efforts were increased drastically, and they mounted massive surveillance operations that canvassed most local transport hubs. And Romanov was arrested for behaving suspiciously at a bus station at this time, but again avoided suspicion on the murder charges, as his blood type did not match the suspect's profile. But he was imprisoned for 3 months for a number of minor outstanding offenses. You see, what was not realized at the time was that Romanov's actual blood type was type A, and it was different to the type found in his other bodily fluids, which would be type AB from his semen, as he was a member of a minority group known as non-secretors whose blood type cannot be inferred by anything other than blood alone samples. And as the police only had a sample of semen and not blood from the crime scene, Romanov was able to escape suspicion of murder. And it is to be noted that today's sophisticated DNA techniques are not subject to the same fallibility. So, following his release, Romanov found work as a traveling buyer for a train company based in Novocherkassk, and managed to keep a low profile until August 1985, when he murdered 2 women in separate incidents. At around the same time as these murders, Burakov, frustrated at the lack of positive progress, engaged the help of psychiatrist Alexander Burkanovsky, who refined the profile of the killer, describing him as a necrosadist, or someone who achieves sexual gratification from the suffering and death of others. Burkanovsky also placed the killer's age as between 45 and 50, significantly older than had been believed up to that point. So, desperate to catch the killer, Burakov even interviewed a serial killer, Anatoly Slivko, shortly before his execution, in an attempt to gain some insight into the elusive serial killer's mind. Coinciding with this attempt to understand the mind of a killer, attacks seemed to dry up, and police suspected that their target might have stopped killing, been incarcerated for other crimes, or died. However, early in 1988, Romanov again resumed his killings, the majority occurring away from the Rostov area, and victims were no longer taken from local public transport outlets, as police surveillance of these areas continued. So, over the next 2 years, the body count increased by a further 19 victims, and it appeared that the killer was taking increasing risks. focusing primarily on young boys and often killing in public places where the risk of detection was far higher. And the recently unfettered media of Gorbachev's Glasnost society placed enormous public pressure on police forces to catch the killer. And general police patrols were stepped up, with Burakov targeting likely areas with undercover police in an attempt to flush out the killer. Romanov evaded capture narrowly on a couple of occasions, but on the 6th of November 1990, fresh from killing his final victim, Sveta Korostik, his suspicious behavior was noted by patrolling policemen at the station nearby, and his details were taken. His name was linked to his previous arrest in 1984, and he was placed under surveillance. Then, Romanov was arrested on November 20th, 1990, following even more suspicious behavior, but he refused at first to confess to any of the killings. So, Burakov decided to allow the psychiatrist Bukhanovsky, who had prepared the original profile, to talk to Romanov under the guise of trying to understand the mind of a killer from a scientific context. So Romanov was clearly flattered by this approach, and he opened up to the psychiatrist, providing extensive details on all of his killings, and even leading police to the site of bodies previously undiscovered. He claimed to have taken the lives of 56 victims, although only 53 of these could be independently verified. This figure was far in excess of the 36 cases that the police had initially attributed to their serial killer. So, having been declared sane and fit to stand trial, Romanov went to court on the 14th of April, 1992. And throughout the trial, he was held in an iron cage designed to keep him apart from the relatives of his many victims. And he was referred to in the media as the maniac. And his behavior in court ranged from bored to manic, singing and talking gibberish at one point, and at other points he was even reported to have dropped his trousers, waving his genitals at the assembled crowd. So the judge appeared less than impartial, often overruling Romanov's defense lawyer, and it was clear that Romanov's guilt was a foregone conclusion. The trial lasted until August, and surprisingly, given the judge's bias, the verdict was not announced until 2 months later. And on the 15th of October 1990, when Romanov was found guilty on 52 of the 53 murder charges and sentenced to death for each one of his murders. After this, Romanov appealed, and his appeal centered around the claim that the psychiatric evaluation which had found him fit to stand trial was biased. But this process was unsuccessful, and 16 months later, he was executed by a shot to the back of the head. And that happened on the 14th of February, 1994. The psychiatrist who had been instrumental in his capture, Alexander Bukhanovsky, went on to become a celebrated expert on sexual disorders and serial killers. If you enjoyed this, take a moment to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. And share this video with everyone that you know. It's the most important part. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.